Hello, Sunshines. This is Ms. Varize, and I am going to take you through how to write stronger introduction and conclusion paragraphs for your literary analysis benchmark essay. Apologies in advance if I sound a little weird. I have a cold, but we're working through it. Okay. So, what I want you to do is I want you to think about your essay and really like any piece of kind of argumentative or academic writing that you do as a journey that you're taking your reader on. So, again, think about your essay like this journey, this trip that you are taking your reader on. And if your essay is a journey, then the whole introduction paragraph contains these three things. You have your opening, which is like the invitation to the journey, right? It's setting the vibe, it's setting the tone for what you ultimately want your reader to discover about themselves, about the world, and obviously about the story that you're analyzing. Then in the introduction, you have a couple of sentences called the synopsis, right? Where you just kind of summarize the story as a whole in preparation for your thesis. And that synopsis is like the map, right? It's giving this kind of bird's eye view of the overall story to kind of give the reader a reminder of like, this is where we are, right? This is where we're going. And then your thesis, which we've already practiced a bunch in here, your thesis is your itinerary. So that is actually laying out, here are all the things we're going to cover, here are all the things we are going to do, here are all the things you're going to see on this trip. So again, the introduction has the invitation, the map, and the itinerary. Then all of your body paragraphs, that's the actual trip. Like that is the actual journey that you are taking your reader on. They haven't actually started anything until that first body paragraph. Then you're actually getting into it. You're showing them a bunch of stuff. You're like, look over here, look at that piece of evidence. Look over here, look at that piece of evidence. Let me tell you what it means, right? All that stuff. So the body paragraphs are the actual trip. And then your conclusion, the way to think about that is the conclusion is like the scrapbook of the memories that you want them to hold on to. Like if they're only going to walk away with a couple of things, what are the things that you want them to hold on to? What are the things that you always want them to remember? So keep this analogy in mind as we start talking about introductions and conclusions. So again, I want to focus on this concept of like the opening or the lead, right? This invitation into the paper that you're going to write, the argument that you're about to make. Now, I know everyone in here is aware of the concept of the hook, right? Which is like, oh, you need to hook your audience, you need to do an attention grabber, right? So a question, a statistic, a startling statement, a quotation, a definition, a single word. You guys are all aware of this, right? You've seen this before. I've taught this many, many times, right? I've given my students a list of possible hooks and I've said, pick one and go for it. So if with the idea of the hook in mind, let's look at an example an example introduction paragraph. So notice in orange there at the top, obviously this is for an example how to fight monsters essay. The opening there at the top is my hook, right? In this case, I used the dictionary definition idea. So I have, according to Webster's dictionary, resistance is defined as the inherent ability of an organism to resist harmful influences. Okay, cool. Like that's kind of related to resistance. It kind of gives some sort of attention grabbing idea to my reader. They know that I'm going to be talking about resistance in this essay. Then that second chunk, that teal chunk, is the synopsis. So in there, I'm giving an overview of the story, but also notice that I'm focusing on the parts of the story that have to do with my thesis. You do not want to give an entire like play-by-play of the entire story for your reader. Like your reader in this case is your teacher, right? But you always want to assume with lit analysis that your reader has read the story, right? Like we've all read this story, obviously, but they just haven't thought about it in the way that you have. So you want to give them kind of this overview, like remember this story, but you don't have to retell the entire thing. You just need to focus on the parts that have to do with your thesis and your topic. So here's my synopsis. In Sherman Alexie's short story, How to Fight Monsters, notice how I have title, author, and genre there. A Spokane Indian kid named Junior leaves his reservation school to attend Reardon, a nearby high school that offers a better education than he can get on the res. At his new school, Junior struggles to fit in as the only Native American student among his all-white peers and eventually responds to a racist comment with physical violence. So notice how I'm trying to establish like why he's there, right? He's like there for this sense of like betterment and an attempt to like be more successful with himself, with his life, etc. And then also though, I have to get in the fact that he does fight, right? That there is this incident of violence because that's setting up my thesis. So take a second and look at that synopsis and notice the details of the story that I chose to include and all the details I chose to leave out. Then I have my thesis, and you guys have seen this thesis before in all the examples that we've given you. Through Junior's development from a bullied loser Indian son with low self-esteem to a warrior who is willing to fight for his people, Sherman Alexie highlights the ways in which violent resistance can help to empower people of color while simultaneously causing them to become further marginalized. And we've talked about like what makes this thesis be more complex than ones we're typically used to. So those are my three chunks of my intro, right? Opening, synopsis, thesis. And you saw from my hook that I used that second to the bottom one of starting with a definition. We've all seen this type of intro before, right? But what I want you to do now that you're in high school, and now especially that you're in ethnic studies, and you're able to look at your lit analysis writing a little bit differently than we would in a typical English class, I want us to level up a bit with our introduction paragraphs. Yeah, it's a hook, and a hook is cool, but also look at the fish's face. Look how bummed he is. I think we can do better for ourselves and for this fish. So let me tell you how we want to encourage you to write your introduction paragraphs for your ethnic studies lit analysis essay. And that involves letting go of the hook and doing something a bit cooler. So one of our kind of central tenets of ethnic studies is this idea that James Baldwin says so simply and elegantly here, which is that we carry our history with us, right? It's why we're not just reading these stories through a literary lens of like symbolism and metaphor and stuff like that we would typically do. We're also learning about like the historical context for these stories, right? What has happened throughout centuries, throughout decades, and that like informs not just the writer writing this, but also the character's individual journey. So we want you to think about your opening especially, right? So I'm talking about that part where you would typically put the hook. I want you to let go of that idea of hooking your partner or grabbing their attention. We don't want them to feel bummed out like this fish, right? Instead of doing that, think about that idea of your opening to your essay as this invitation to not just this argument that you're about to make, it is that, but also think about how you might position this fictional story, right? Because How to Fight Monsters is fictional, Paper Menagerie is fictional, right? These things didn't actually happen. But how might you position this fictional story within a real life historical context? How might you lay the actual history and real life groundwork that your story exists in? And also to show show off like the cool work that you've been doing, right? So use that history we've been talking about here to actually make your intro stronger and more compelling and smarter in so many ways. So here's what that might look like. So remember that for my first example of our intro paragraph, we had that, kind of typical like Webster's dictionary hook. We're going to let that go. We don't want to see that again. So what do I put there? Well, if I'm going to do this kind of historical context introduction, right? I need to make sure I know history and enough history to kind of be able to pull from my own knowledge, right? Or I might have to look stuff up. So I'm going to sit here and think about, okay, what's all kind of the history I know off the top of my head about like Native American history, right? And I can think about people being removed, Native people being removed from their land, and that land kind of just being freely given away, manifest destiny, that kind of thing. I can think about the Native American boarding schools, right? That idea of, quote, kill the Indian, save the man, where it was just like mass assimilation at a pretty horrific scale in terms of killing language and traditions and things like that, things that many, nations, tribes, and nations can't get back again. I know about, such things, major events such as the massacre at Wounded Knee. I know about like the Long Walk of the Dine. Not only, these kind of like violent, mass killings of Native Americans, but also like mass removal and like replacement, forced movement of Native Americans as well, turning them into like refugees from their own lands, right? And then I also know, not only because I'm from the Bay Area, but also just that I've learned about in teaching Marrow Thieves, is the occupation of Alcatraz Island, which I'll talk about here in a second. So when I think about all of these different events that I know off the top of my head, I could also do some research as well if stuff wasn't really coming to me or the stuff that I already knew didn't fit. But there is one in here that I think does fit, one that really is an example of resistance, which is what my essay is about, and that is the occupation of Alcatraz. So let's look at that a little bit more closely. So from November 1969 to June 1971, there was this group called Indians of All Tribes. Then they occupied Alcatraz Island. They literally showed up to this site. It was a former prison. You may have seen like movies like The Rock, Escape from Alcatraz, things like that. It was a federal prison for a while, and then it was empty. It was no longer used as a prison, so it was just kind of this dilapidated, rundown building. This group of Native peoples from all over the country and from a bunch of different nations and tribes all just showed up. They relocated to the Bay Area. They showed up to the island together, and their goal was to hold the rock, to protest against the United States government's policies that took Aboriginal land away from American Indians and aimed to destroy their cultures. It lasted, as you can see, for a couple of years, and it wasn't successful in terms of like, did they all get the land back? Like, no, they did not. But the Alcatraz occupation was this catalyst for this much broader movement for progress in contemporary Native American history. And the key part about it is that it was the first intertribal protest action. So it wasn't one nation, right? It wasn't like one tribe fighting for this thing that pertained to them. It was Native Americans from all tribes coming together to focus the nation's attention on the situation of Native peoples in the United States. And even though maybe some of the organizers and certainly like the government who eventually got them out would call it kind of a failure, because of the attention that was brought to the plight of American Indian communities because of the occupation. There was actually a lot of stuff that happened directly following that, and still today. Federal laws were created which demonstrated new respect for Aboriginal land rights and for the freedom of American Indians to maintain their traditional cultures. So in the moment, it may have seemed like it wasn't that big of a deal, but you can also kind of put a dot, you can mark a line from the moment of that occupation and kind of see the progress that has happened since then. So that is the occupation of Alcatraz, and we'll talk more about this event and others like it when we start reading Marrow Thieves. But now notice how I can use that for my opening instead of a more traditional, and let's be real, not as cool hook, right? Like, what was that dictionary definition? It was just like, I looked up definition of resistance and slapped it on there, right? Notice how much cooler this is. So now my opening looks like this. Over 50 years ago, on November 20th, 1969, a group of indigenous activists known as the Indians of All Tribes arrived at a former federal prison in the San Francisco Bay. They would occupy it for a year and a half. Protesting the government's mistreatment of Native people, including a policy known as termination that took tribes' land and attempted to eliminate their sovereign status, the activists reignited a movement for recognition and justice, a fight that Native peoples continue today in both large-scale and everyday acts of resistance. So notice how I take kind of that history of that event, and now that is my opening. I am now situating How to Fight Monsters within this like broader historical context, like what history does this story carry with it? But I also am situating Junior's act of resistance, as small as it is, within this broader history of resistance, right? Notice how I kind of had to finesse it a little bit. Like, you don't just want to be like, this thing happened now in this story. So the way that I finessed it is, if you look at, oh, do I have like a arrow? I don't. Okay. So if you look at toward the end of my opening, toward the end of that orange section, after the M dash. So the activists reignited a movement for recognition and justice, a fight that Native peoples continue today in both large scale and everyday acts of resistance. That everyday acts of resistance, that part was like the little bridge to How to Fight Monsters, because obviously, you know, Junior is not organizing a mass protest, right? He is punching a dude in the face. But that connects back to that idea of like an everyday act, right? So then that can lead a little bit more fluidly and elegantly into my synopsis. And then you can see my synopsis and my thesis are the same ones I had before. Do you kind of see what we're getting at here? I hope that you do. So the thing is, though, if you are going to do a historical context intro paragraph, which is what we're asking you to do for this little analysis essay, you need to build up your knowledge of history. So obviously you guys are not writing about How to Fight Monsters. You're going to be going back and adding an introduction paragraph to your paper menagerie half essay. So you know some stuff already from the stations that we did for ABC, but we want to just expand on that, because the more historical context knowledge you have, the more you can pull from, right? If I hadn't known about the occupation of Alcatraz, I would not have been able, right, to just like make that my introduction. So what you guys are going to do is pause here. You're going to open the Paper Menagerie History Choice Board assignment that's posted on Schoology. There are 3 columns. So column A is about Chinese immigration specifically, which obviously is a key topic for Paper Menagerie. Then the middle column are 2 readings from Facing History. One is about restricting immigration, and one is about race and citizenship, that idea of like who gets to be American, etc. And then column C are 2 videos that are about like other groups of immigrants that faced similar discrimination and similar bias as Chinese immigrants did, but also ended in a different way, and like why. So you need to choose one option from each column minimum. If you want to look at more, that's totally cool. If you want to build your knowledge beyond that, that's great. But you need to choose 1 video from column A, 1 reading from column B, and 1 video from column C. Go ahead and jot down notes in your notebook, because obviously this stuff is also relevant to American-born Chinese potentially. So you may end up using something similar, depends. So jot down notes as you look at them, and be thinking as you're watching the videos or reading the articles, like what might be cool for your introduction paragraph for Paper Menagerie. Oh, when you're done with that, come back here. Okay, hi, so we're back. Okay, so now that you've looked at your different like possibilities, right? Like additional historical facts that you can add. Now you want to think about how you might use one or more of those pieces of information to be a cool opening for your intro for Paper Menagerie. So you're going to open up the document that's on Schoology. The first thing you want to do is copy and paste your half essay into the appropriate sections. So you'll paste your thesis into the thesis box. You'll copy and paste your actual body paragraph into the body paragraph box. Then what I want you to do is I want you to add in that top box a cool opening, right? This time using historical context. So no more hooks, no more statistics or dictionary definitions or anything like that. You can see my example here if you want to use that for guidance. Then in the synopsis box, you're going to create that kind of overview, that map, right? That bird's eye view of the story with a focus on the elements that are important to remember for your particular thesis, for your particular topic. Go ahead and finish that and then come back here for conclusion stuff. Okay, and we're back. So remember we talked about introductions being kind of setting the stage for your journey, right? It's the invitation, the map, the itinerary. You're giving off the vibe of what people are going to be getting and then kind of telling them, here's the stuff you're going to see. So your conclusions then, if we're keeping with that analogy, are what are like the main images, the main ideas that you want your reader to take with them. If you're taking them on this journey, right, they've kind of been with you this whole time. They've been immersed in your ideas this whole time. Now as they return, right, to the world, what do you want to linger? What do you want them to remember about what you had to say here? Think about, if we're going to take this analogy further, and I always do, think about how like visiting a new place kind of changes us, right? Like you end a journey hopefully a little bit different than you were before you started. How do you want your reader to be changed by your ideas? How do you want them to maybe look at themselves or the world a little bit differently? What we want to get away from is the idea of just like restating our thesis or like restating our topic sentences. So I'm going to give you 3 conclusion strategies to try out, and you're going to pick one to do for your paper menagerie half essay. So the 3 strategies are the bookend, the lesson, and the image, and I'll show you what those look like. All of these, regardless of which one you do, all have that same goal of trying to create a lingering idea with the reader. They're not going to remember everything from your essay. There's no way. So what is the thing you really want them to walk away with? So the first strategy is a bookend strategy. And what I mean by bookend is that you return to whatever you did in your opening and then you build off of that. So in this case, we have a historical context opening, right? So I opened my How to Fight Monsters essay with this historical account of the occupation of Alcatraz. Now I am going to return to that opening, but I'm not just going to come full circle. Full circle implies we're just going to start exactly where we began. That kind of implies that I'm going to be repetitive. I'm not. Instead, I am going to try to build beyond that, right? So go back to my opening and then take it farther. So here's what I have. Of course, punching Roger in the face does not put money in Junior's pocket, change the racist school mascot, or give much-needed resources to the res. Similarly, when the occupation of Alcatraz ended in January 1971, notice how I shifted there from How to Fight Monsters back to my historical account. The activist demands were not met. Turtle Island was not reinstated to indigenous peoples. Reparations were not given for centuries of oppression and loss. However, the drumbeat of resistance that began on Alcatraz would echo for decades afterward. Sacred lands were returned. Policies were passed to protect tribal sovereignty. Thousands joined the mass protests at Standing Rock. Junior's act of resistance does not solve his problems, but after months of feeling lost at Reardon, the choice to punch Roger reconnects Junior with his community and his own morality. He may still feel like an alien, but by choosing to stand up for himself and his people, like the activists at Alcatraz, Junior starts a drumbeat for justice that can echo for years to come. So notice how I return to that idea of the occupation, but then I also kind of complicate it a bit. And I use the complexities of the Alcatraz occupation, which is it could be seen by people kind of as this failure, right? Because they didn't get everything that they wanted. They're not still there, right? It was over. But it also was not a failure at all, right? In terms of the legacy that it served. So in thinking about that, I asked myself, how is Junior's resistance kind of similar in that it's not maybe a complete success, right? He doesn't feel great at the end, right? Like he's still kind of stuck. He's still kind of lost, but how might it be something that has a similar kind of legacy as the Alcatraz resistance did? So that's an example. Do you see how I like returned back to my opening, but then built it out from there? Now let's look at the lesson. So the lesson strategy might be something that you're kind of like already used to doing, but the idea is just that the idea that you leave with your reader is not a return to your opening, right? Instead, it's kind of you want them to take away your own message. Like think about how we're looking at these stories for theme, right? What's a lesson that we learn? What's a message that we can take away for our own lives or for like society or whatever? You're kind of doing something similar here. Like if your reader is going to walk away with like one lesson to take away from your writing, like what do you want it to be? So here's my example, and notice how different this conclusion is, even though like the fundamental ideas of resistance and the complexities of it is still there. I'm approaching this conclusion in a very different way. Yes, Junior continues to feel lost at Riordan after punching Roger in the face, but he has unknowingly rediscovered an essential aspect of his identity, his moral compass. By fighting back against such callous racism, Junior stands up for himself, his community, and all communities who constantly endure the same taunts and insults. Instead of trying to blend into the walls, he chooses to protect others. Violence should not be the answer, but at some point in our lives, we all must decide which of our values are worth fighting for. I think that still does kind of like connect back to my, if I were to use this with my Alcatraz opening, I think it still works because that's all about fighting for something too, right? But notice just with that last line, right, I'm kind of making this statement about what's the lesson I want my reader to take away. And I phrase it like a literal lesson for them to learn. Notice in this final one, the image, how the beginning of my conclusion is the same. So look at the first like 3-4 sentences of my lesson conclusion, and now look at the first 3-4 sentences of my image conclusion. Same idea, but notice how the ending is different. So with the lesson, right, I have this, my purpose is to give this lesson, this message for my audience to walk away with. Like, here's the thing, literally, that I want you to learn, right? But with image, it's not about a lesson that I want them to walk away with. They may still walk away with a lesson, and that's cool, but instead I am leaving this lingering image in their minds. So notice the difference here. Everything at the beginning is the same, so I'm not going to reread it. I'll just start from instead of trying. Instead of trying to blend into the walls, he chooses to protect others. As Junior walks away from the fight, under the shadow of Riordan's racist mascot and still carrying the weight of centuries of oppression and loss, he may not have found his place, but he is able to stand just a little bit straighter. So I'm still kind of like implying that idea that like he should be proud of what he did, even if it's kind of messed up and even if like there are consequences to be had. But I'm not just saying he should be proud, right? Instead, I'm creating an image that conveys and captures that sense of pride. So if you're more of like a creative writer, if you like to write poetry, if you like to write more image-rich stuff, this might be a cool one to try out for your conclusion, because you can kind of take that idea of this like image-rich moment and make that the lingering thing for your reader. Okay, so we talked about 3, the bookend, where we return to our historical context opening and then build from there. The lesson, where you like literally state a message you want your reader to walk away with, or an image where you may be conveying a message, but more importantly, you're leaving this like lingering image in their head. Now you guys get to pick. So go ahead and write a conclusion for your half essay using one of the strategies we just learned. I'm going to fix this slide so the examples are actually in those text boxes. That would help. But pick one and try it out and see which one you like. If you want to try a couple of them and then talk to your teacher or just decide for yourself which one you like more, feel free. But we want to see one of these strategies being used in that conclusion section on your document. All right, have fun with this, try something new, and hopefully you grow as a writer because of it. Thanks for listening. Bye. Where's my arrow? Oh, there we go.